Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts, Ariana and Seth.
This is the Pop Cult Podcast. I'm Seth.
I'm Ariana.
And we once again return to 1995 for another pair of movies. We'll be talking about a Japanese anime anthology a little later called Memories. But first up, we're going to be talking about The Addiction, which is a film written and directed by Abel Ferrara directed it, but it was written by Nicholas St. John. Came out in 1995, of course. And this was a film made by Abel Ferrara, who you may not be familiar with. Was sort of an independent New York-based filmmaker who worked a lot with Christopher Walken. Mm-hmm. He made some like slashery movies, The Driller Killer, Miss 45. They're very like pulpy, grindhousey kind of movies. And then eventually, in 1990, he made King of New York, which is the only other film of his I've seen. Or actually, I've seen two of his films. King of New York, which was a Christopher Walken-led movie about a mobster who gets out of prison and kind of loses it. His most famous film is probably Bad Lieutenant with Harvey Keitel. Famous for, you can see Harvey Keitel's junk in the movie. I think it was rated NC-17 for like violence and things like that. And then that's the movie they made a sequel to with Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans, which was directed by Werner Herzog and starred Nicolas Cage. Yeah, so I don't know, but the only connection between those two movies is they're about cops who are just like utter pieces of shit.
That's all cops.
Yeah. Ferrara also directed a remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers called Body Snatchers, which I remember seeing that on TV years ago. And that was during his sort of Hollywood period. King of New York got him a lot of attention, and Bad Lieutenant. He did a couple movies in Hollywood. They did not do well at the box office. And so The Addiction is Ferrara returning to New York, returning to these low-budget indie roots to make a movie in the style that he wanted to. So that's kind of the backstory. And I know this was your first Abel Ferrara film, I believe.
Yep.
So The Addiction is about vampires. But is a little different than, I mean, it's at this, by 1995 was sort of, if you're going to make a movie about vampires, you needed to have some sort of angle, right? So this movie is, after being bitten by a vampire, a New York grad student named Kathleen tries to come to terms with her new lifestyle and constant thirst for blood, adopting the philosophy of a nocturnal comrade, whatever the hell that means. It uses vampirism in a very heavy-handed way as a metaphor for a drug addiction, but then it's also about lots of other things. So what were your feelings and thoughts just generally about this movie?
I thought in a weird way it might also just be talking about being assaulted, but like the switcheroo was supposed to be like she got assaulted by a woman, and it's just a very pretentious movie at the end of the day. It just like it's all over the place. There's just a lot that I was just like, I mean, it's pretty bad because a lot of times I was just like, how long is this? Like, when is this done?
Well, the character of Kathleen is played by Lily Taylor, and she is writing her doctoral thesis on, it appears to be just like man's inhumanity to man, which seems like a very...
She's like a philosophy student.
Yeah, and that's where the problems arise, I think, and that she's a philosophy student. I think the movie's ultimate problem is not necessarily pretension more than it is incoherence and being very muddled thematically, because it tries to do this vampirism as a drug addiction thing, but I don't really feel like it stayed with that much, because then it would go back to the sort of like, we're seeing images of like the Holocaust in the Vietnam War, like the My Lai massacre. And then I think they even used footage from like, the Serbian massacre that had happened around that time. And it's constantly showing you those images, trying to draw some connection between that and her vampirism. And then there's a lot of voiceover from Kathleen where she's saying very heady philosophical things. And so and then there's also Ferrara himself. He's Italian background, very Catholic. I'd almost say he has more Catholic guilt than Martin Scorsese, it feels like. And so like that's an element in the movie, but none of it ever feels cohesive like as one thing. It just kind of feels like the movie pivots to a different thing every once in a while.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I was just like, oh, is it about assault? And is it having to do with the fact of like the violence that we put on each other?
I do think that's a part of it, yes.
And how we continue the violence and then like only to turn around and tell the victim that it was their fault.
Yes, I do think he is examining the idea of victim blaming, because when Kathleen first gets attacked by Casanova, a vampire played by Annabella Sciorra, Casanova's like telling her to beg for your life, plead, fight back, do something. And Kathleen just seems paralyzed and unable to do anything.
Well, she's not even telling her to beg. She's like, tell me to fuck off.
Yeah.
Tell me to fuck off with meaning. Do it with authority. And what happens is like she ends up being like, please don't hurt me.
Yeah,
she's like,
begging.
I didn't ask you to beg. She's like, I want you to tell me to fuck off. And then the moment once they're like, she's bitten and she's confused as to what's happening, Casanova looks at her and is like, well, if you had told me to fuck off the way I wanted you to, then this would have never happened. And
so is it victim blaming? Is that the movie going like, maybe if you fought back, it wouldn't happen to you?
It's like this also like this weird thing of it being like it wants to be about vampires or addiction, but it also like Casanova doesn't tell her like what has happened. It was just sort of like she just disappears only to reappear in the movie, and you're kind of like,
when did they meet up again?
Supposed to like hate her or just be totally cool with her? And it's, Kathleen is supposed to be friends with Jean, who's played by Edie Falco. And the relationship just feels very academic, not personal at all, until like Kathleen had disappeared because she was quote unquote sick. And then Jean sent her some flowers. So you don't really understand like what's the closeness of this relationship supposed to be about? Like, why is it necessary? Like, why are they friends?
Yeah, because it's like they're just in the same program together.
Yeah, because it's just supposed to be like all they do is like go to academic stuff together. It's never anything like a personal note.
Yeah, it feels more like a professional relationship than a friendship.
Yeah, like there's a scene where like Kathleen is sitting and Jean sits down with her lunch and just starts like doing her work while she's eating. And I found it very awkward because it just sort of like at no point before this like were they indicating that is a total normal behavior on both parts where you just sit down and you just work.
Well, that's where I feel like the movie is trying to say something about Kathleen and Kathleen as an academic and then academics in general.
Yeah.
Like I feel like maybe he was attempting to say something like how we intellectualize systemic violence and massacres in a way that like shields us from having to deal with like the inhumanity of them, which is a good point to make. But that's the point I'm assuming that Ferrara is making. The film doesn't help me support that completely.
Yeah, and then at some point she goes on a date with her professor, who's like her top professor, the professor that's sort of like, yeah, you've missed a few classes, but as long as you write your thesis, you should be fine. And it was she just seemed like she's like dogging on him the whole time, just being like, just making quotes just to be like, oh, you're just blah blah blah. And I can't even do the quotes because she's just like going off.
I only remember one quote from this movie.
Okay, what's that quote?
Let me prepare myself for this. I remember it because it was so pretentious. Medicine's just a metaphor for. Oh, now I forgot it. I gotta look it up. Hold up. Medicine is just a metaphor for omnipotence.
Yeah, that happens when she's like sitting with Jean, and Jean's like, "Are you taking your medicine?" And she's like, and she ends up saying that.
I'm just like, what it's like. And it's so I'm trying to figure out, like, is Ferrara is it satirical in that he is using her as a way to mock intellectuals he sees as like disconnected from humanity? Because it's a movie that has like these two sides to it. You have this like highly intellectual academic side, and then like they use a lot of Cypress Hill music.
Yeah.
There's a lot of scenes really depicting like the griminess of New York City in 1995, the kind of people that you're going to run into. Like, she walks home through like a predominantly black neighborhood, so you have a lot of like young men who are kind of hanging out on the street, because that was kind of the culture at the time.
Yeah.
Just figure out like what's going on in the neighborhood. And I never feel like those people are portrayed in a negative light. So it leaves me thinking, like, so is she the protagonist, but we're also not supposed to like her?
I think it's a weird mix because, again, it feels like the vampirism has to do in some way with being assaulted, at the least like the way that she then puts it on other people and the way that she's like, it's on her. And so the first time we see her like go down that street with predominantly black men, she makes herself smaller, she looks intimidated, only for the second time she's kind of like getting like closer to them. Like, even her posture is a little taller, and like Jean kind of pulls her away to be like, hey, don't fucking engage with them, kind of thing. And then it's hard to get, especially because in the middle of the film, Christopher Walken appears.
Well, I want to talk about his appearance. Do we want to talk about that now?
Yeah, let's just do
Okay.
it.
So he's second billed in the cast, and he's only in the movie for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's like they got him for a day.
And it's the best part of the movie. Like, his character is the best thing in this movie. He is a vampire who's been doing this for a couple centuries, but he's been engaged in a decades-long fast where he does not drink blood. And he talks about how what he's basically done is he's conditioned himself to be like a human.
Mhm.
He eats, he uses the bathroom, he does all the things that humans do that vampires don't. And that he seems to speak as if like he's awakened something in himself by refusing to indulge in that hunger. And he, like I said, he's only in the movie for 10 minutes. He was a character named Pina. And then he just disappears from the movie, and we never see him again.
Yeah. Like, and I think the sad thing is he appears in the film. You think maybe she's going to adopt a few of the things he says, but immediately afterwards she attacks someone.
Yeah, it's like, once again, it's where I'm like, am I not getting something about the themes here? Because it felt very like Abel Ferrara wanted to make a vampire movie. He wanted to set it in New York City, right? He wanted to have a certain aesthetic, which he accomplishes. Like, that's one of the things. The movie is visually beautiful. His cinematographer, Ken Kelch, it's all black and white. He does a very good job of using like shadow and using the architecture of New York and finding interesting locations. So all that's done very well. But then you're not quite like, the end of the movie is very open-ended about exactly what happened. But there is this implication that like an acceptance of God from a Catholic priest potentially saves her in some way or something.
Which is really weird because like there's a moment where she has supposedly graduated, and like a little bit before that, so she encounters herself with an anthropology student played by Catherine
Herb,
and
who you might know as, I know her as the oldest, as the daughter in What About Bob? But I think she was also on like a Law and Order or something.
yeah, she was like, I think
Criminal Intent or something.
yeah, I think she was like it was like was she like partners with Jeff Goldblum, and then
Yeah, I think that was Criminal Intent.
Blah 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 before
who knows?
Yeah, because we're gonna go deep into that.
I don't care about
But
that.
okay, so she bites her, and they have a conversation which is like, it's reflection on the conversation that Casanova had with Kathleen the first time, like she bit her.
Sort of blaming you for not finding back.
Yes, and we're watching that whole thing happen, and then skip a little bit ahead. Kathleen has bitten multiple people. We don't really know if they're dead or alive, but then we realize they are alive, except for this anthropology student during her graduation party where she invites different people, and then they all, including Casanova,
all the vampires
start attacking. And it's like this weird thing, like at no point do we hear like Catherine like explain about vampirism or just being like, hey, you guys are gonna be fucking fine.
She doesn't seem to do anything to prepare them.
She does nothing to prepare them. She's doing the same thing that Casanova does. And it's like this weird thing. We see Casanova and we've not seen Casanova in the whole entire film since the first attack.
If you people are in communication, what are you communicating? Because like the film never posits itself as something that feels like, oh, this is all, a dream or something. It feels very grounded. Like the vampirism is like the one fantastic thing in the whole movie. But then you're like, off screen, did she meet up with everybody and plan this? Or what's going on?
Did she like tell them, hey, you have to be there at this, which is also like this bizarre thing, because like, so is it supposed to be like after you've been bitten by this vampire, you're just gonna do whatever the fuck they say because you have to?
But then if Casanova shows up and she's the one that bit Kathleen, so it's one of those where he wants to use vampirism as a metaphor for drug addiction, kind of. And he starts out that way with like Kathleen, the first time she gets a hunger for blood, instead of biting someone, she finds like a homeless person who's blacked out and then uses a needle to draw blood out of him.
Yeah.
And then injects that into her own veins.
And that's when her eyes like roll back as if she's just done drugs.
And so you're very heavy-handed, like, oh, it's the vampirism is supposed to be heroin. But Ferrara doesn't carry that metaphor. Like, you can overextend a metaphor. He doesn't really extend it. He just kind of introduces it, and then that's it. And he just kind of sits there.
And then, so she's bitten all these people. I forget the reason why she's in the hospital the last time.
Is it because they think she has anemia or something?
Yeah, and like she asked the nurse to open the windows because I think it's supposed to be like she's trying to kill herself by having the sun reflect on her, which is also this weird thing because she is out in the sun occasionally, but with sunglasses.
Yeah, well, if you have sunglasses on, it can't hurt you, I guess.
And like Casanova appears and she's like, "Not so fast, dearie," kind of attitude. Not exactly that. It's just being like, "Yeah, you think you could kill yourself and get away with it," kind of shit. And that's when later on the priest shows up and like,
it's just very. I don't understand what Abel Ferrara was doing with this movie. And I've read a little bit about like the commentary track on the DVD, and they say it's very, who Michael Rappaport is.
No.
You do, though. That's the thing. He's that. Okay, let me see. Michael Rappaport. How do I remind you of someone you know who he is? Copland with Sylvester Stallone. Do we remember this movie?
Yeah.
Do you know who I'm talking about when I say Michael Rappaport now?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about him. Because I don't. No, you don't know who he is. That's it. Do you remember the cop who's kind of the inciting incident of the whole thing? The one who kills the two guys. He thinks they have guns.
He's kind of like that redhead dude that's like a super liberal that just you want him to shut up because he's always on TikTok.
Yes. Yeah. So now I'm trying to figure out why I said Michael Rappaport in the first place because I had to explain who he was. So commentary tracks. Ferrara, like the way I heard his commentary being described, like the tone of it made me think of like listening to Michael Rappaport for 2 hours talk about a movie. Because I think like at one point he's supposed to go like, "It's New York, fucking baby, yeah." Like, kind of thing.
This before.
No, I haven't.
I have never talking about something.
I have never listened to this before. I didn't even listen to this. I just read what somebody said about it. And it's just he fucking loves New York. That's very true about Abel Ferrara. It's not a lie. But he's just kind of a guy who has some like talent for making movies. Because it's like we said, it's not a disaster of a movie. It's just a very messy movie. Now the person he didn't write this movie though. The guy who wrote it, I did read a little quote from him.
Okay, but hold up. I need to point something out about the cast that is just like really fucking bothering me.
I know what you're gonna say.
The black people called Black.
Fredro Starr, who is a rapper who is in the movie. His character is just listed as Black, and he's a black guy. The priest is listed as priest. Now the bartender who's black is listed as bartender.
Yeah.
But then there's a second guy named Black. Oh, yikes! Yikes!
Like the movie was already like pretty like white or like.
We used a lot of rap music. So the screenwriter Nicholas St. John was a guy who's worked a lot with Abel Ferrara. He wrote Driller, Killer, Body Snatchers, and The Addiction, of course. And he wrote those with Ferrara, and he also wrote Miss 45 and King of New York on his own. He had known Ferrara since they were in high school, so I think they have a very similar probably view on things.
Yeah.
And the quote I read from him where he was like, he was in this very like negative mindset, very misanthropic state of mind when he wrote The Addiction. So just being very angry at humanity in general. And it kind of reads like that, like a rather immature person who can't really coherently name what it is they're mad about. And it's like very reactionary a little bit in that way.
Yeah, because I remember when I was watching this film, I was like, oh man, like, even if this film had been a protagonist with a white man, I still would have found this character fucking insufferable at the end of the
It could have been anyone, and it would have been insufferable. But like, I think Miss 45 is very much like that kind of New York exploitation, like Death Wish kind of a movie.
Yeah.
And so this feels in the same vein, no pun intended. Shut up. But it's like, hey, what if instead of it was Charles Bronson with a revolver, it's a vampire doctoral student in philosophy. And so then it's just her walking around the city, biting people, turning them into vampires, and then having just the most heavy-handed voiceover in the world.
Oh yeah, it is. And like what's really like terrible is that like just the movie is a mess, but all I can think during that film, I'm like, God damn it, Lily Taylor's like got such a good face. And it makes me sad that she wasn't like a bigger thing.
Well, she's considered ugly, I'm sure. Like at the time, I'm sure she was considered an ugly person.
She would have been like huge. Like
I think there was even a movie she was in. I want to say it's River Phoenix, where it's like they're teenagers or something, and he like dates her, but it's like his friends challenge him to ask her out because it's one of those horrible fucking movies. But the whole thing is like, oh, he learns, oh, she is a real person, and it's wrong of me to think that about her. When it's like, but she's not ugly though. Like I don't know what you're talking about.
Pretty, and it's just like it is so like the lighting on her is so beautifully done, and I just wonder like if like in the lesbian subculture if they were obsessed with her because it's just
that's the thing is I think because it was very still is very like straight white male dominated, but like even especially back in the 90s, think about what was considered beautiful, like heroin chic.
Yeah, and
so somebody like Lily Taylor, they're gonna go like, nope.
And her dress, like demeanor is almost androgynous
at times. Her voice is very husky.
Yes, and it's just like, and the way like she would wither on the floor, just being like in pain, not being able to move. It's
so like if she had started a career now, I think you were saying this when we watched it, she would have been huge.
Yeah, I think like people would be like, oh, she's like a better version of Kristen Stewart
because like the aesthetic of what we accept with actors now, I think has changed for the better in some ways. There's still a lot of vapid, shallow crap.
There's still a lot of like long ways to go.
But like I think she's a really good actor, even though she's not given the best material here.
No, I mean she is trying. It's just also like I think it's like they told her just play a pretentious bitch,
and she does that. And I think that's why I kind of think like we're supposed to not like her. We're supposed to see her as being kind of hypocritical, or she's making excuses for herself so that she can keep victimizing people. But I just don't think we have the best writer or director to communicate that message.
Yeah, and it's also like this weird thing. It just felt like all they did was read a bunch of philosophy books, like the first ones they could grab, and then
it felt like a freshman taking intro to philosophy,
just highlighting them and then having her read them out loud. And so it was like a lot of times when she's like talking, and there's like, for example, she's talking to the professor who's like comes off very like just like normal, like he's not quoting shit at her, and like she's like every corner just like
she has a cigarette in her sunglasses, like, well, as Heidegger said. That I don't know what Heidegger said.
I don't know either.
So yeah, this movie has like people that fucking love it, and there's a lot of them. That's one thing I noticed when I was looking at, well, what do other people say about this movie? Man, it's like 4.5, 5-star reviews coming out like crazy. And I think for like, if you watch it for 90s camp, maybe where you're like, oh, this was such like an aesthetic and a type of movie in the 90s.
Okay, it's such a New York film when you consider like all the actors that are in it, that you're just sort of like, yeah, that is New York. Like Michael Imperioli shows up for a second, like handing out flyers, and I was just like, why is his name in the titles if he's only there for a few seconds? But it's like fucking New York, baby.
Yeah, that's what... So would you recommend people watch The Addiction?
I know.
Yeah, I'm like, I mean, if you're curious, I guess, but if you don't, you're really not gonna miss anything.
No.
I think the vampire trope has been done in more interesting ways in other movies, and I think there's a lot of other movies that comment on like academic pretension better, and a lot of movies that comment on humanity's violence better.
Yeah.
And this movie is just not very good at doing any of it. Well, we're back and we're talking about Memories, another film from 1995. Now, this is the kind of movie I probably would not have picked up unless I came across it on Letterboxd when I was looking at highly rated movies from 95. It is based on 3 manga short stories created by Katsuhiro Otomo, who I want to say... I'm trying to think of what he is famous for outside of... I want to say he may have directed Akira. I'm not sure. I mean, that's a pretty big statement to go. I think he might have directed one of the greatest anime films ever made. Yeah, like he did. He's
be making fun of me if I did this like recently.
Okay. I may not know a lot about a whole genre of literature I don't read, but I still know things about it. Like if you gave me the title of a movie, I could tell you about it.
But did he?
I'm talking about people you've seen in multiple things and you can't remember who they are. You're like,
What that? Okay.
Yes, he did. He wrote the manga and he wrote and directed the movie.
Okay.
He also did it was the Japanese adaptation of the silent film Metropolis as an anime that was pretty good that I saw a few years ago. So yes, we have these 3 short films based on his writings. He writes and directs the 3rd one in the series, which we'll talk about them in the order that they were shown. So the first film in the collection, and there isn't... I was wondering if there was going to be maybe some kind of like overarching connecting tissue, yeah. And it doesn't. It's just 3 short films. So the first one is called Magnetic Rose and is a supernatural, like dark science fiction story. The Corona is a deep space salvage freighter. It's, picking up ships that were destroyed in battle to sell the scraps. And they encounter a distress signal and go to where the distress signal comes from. And they find a massive spaceship graveyard orbiting a giant space station. 2 of the astronauts go inside to get a closer look. And once they're in, like the inside looks like this sort of like European mansion inside. And they find that it belonged to a opera singer who died at some point. It was her fiance was murdered and then she disappeared. And as they're looking for the signal, they split up and they start encountering like more paranormal things. Eventually, the opera singer Eva appears, and we're not sure, is it her ghost? Is it like a hologram on the ship? Like, what's going on? And it just kind of becomes darker and darker as we go. So, Ariana, we'll talk about them each one at a time. What did you think of Magnetic Rose?
I mean, I thought it was like one of the first times I've ever seen that from my knowledge, a Latin character displayed in Japanese culture. Because it was like...
Oh, because Miguel is one.
Yeah, like I don't know how do I feel about like this. The Latin character is portrayed to be like a womanizer because it's supposed to be like he has like 2 girls that are like he's in contact with, and then there's a weird remark that someone was like, "Oh, don't you have a daughter?" And he's like, "But she's 10," and Miguel's like, "I don't date children." It's just like
that was a weird moment.
More of like, what does that have to do with anything? Why was that there? So it was okay. I think it's just also like adapting to a different sort of
When you hate Japanese people, so I think we need to note that on the podcast.
no. It's just supposed to be like it's a different version of science fiction that I'm not used to.
I felt it was very close to something you like.
What?
Alien. The aesthetics,
yeah,
they're salvagers. Like they're ripping off Alien to a degree.
Yeah,
other than the ghost haunted.
I could understand. I think the ghost haunting thing was the moment that I was just like I started to disconnect a little bit.
But without giving away, it ends up not really being a supernatural thing, right? That was the sense I got. It's just more a technological thing gone wrong.
Yeah, but I think it's just I'm kind of used to like science fiction that it's just sort of like it's a little bit more grounded, and so it's just kind of confusing to just be like she's an opera singer. She happened to be a child prodigy that was able to play blah blah blah.
I'd say the thing that is the weirdest for me was like, where did the space station come from?
Yeah, and I was just like, why are they Victorian clothes? I don't understand.
The space station is massive. It's like a moon.
Yeah, and it's just like insane. It kind of what it reminds me of is when we started watching the best Star Trek stuff, and it was supposed to be the encounter like another alien, but the alien is getting like delayed information about Earth, so they're stuck in like the 1800s, and they're just sort of this is what humans like. They're like, no, we are way more advanced.
But that's not what it is.
I know, but that's what the aesthetic reminded me of like seeing like something.
It was a clash of style.
Yes,
but I think that's the point, right? It's what do you not expect when you go inside the space station? This like Baroque ornate like dance hall, like that's something you don't expect, and I think that's visually very interesting, right?
Yeah, I think it's also you let me know if you picked it up. Did they seem like weirded out by the fact that it was just like, hey, it seems like we're inside of a house now? Because it's supposed to be like
they were more weirded out when they saw like windows and it was showing them outside.
Yes.
I think they weren't as weirded out that like the design of the ship.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of like I kind of wish there was like maybe an element to explain like why they were like cool about it, but it's
because this is normal in their world.
Yeah.
That's why they weren't weirded out. Great.
Thank you for mansplaining that for me.
Well, it's a good thing I was here. So like what did you
have fun?
We have fun here. We have fun on this podcast. Did you feel that it was an effective story?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we cleared that up. I think it had enough twists and it was able to convince you that a certain thing was real long enough that when the truth came out, I was genuinely surprised, where I was like, oh, okay, so it wasn't what I thought it was. I thought the animation did a very good job of capturing scale when they would do the outer space sequences where you see the ships and the station and the sense of the station just being this massive object.
Yeah.
And it was one of those where I think the build up to going to the station was scarier than when they got on it.
Yeah.
Because then when they got on it, it's just like, Miguel feels like he's going outside while he's still in the space station and he's in like a garden and he's talking to Eva. Near the end, of course, it kind of comes back to the horror elements more.
Yeah.
There were certain things I wasn't 100% clear on. Like, Carlo has that whole thing with his daughter.
Oh.
How does the ship
know? I remember, like, it turns out, like, but it's not Carlo. I think it's supposed to be, it's another person.
Oh, yeah, Heinz.
Yeah.
So it's because Carlo's the fiance.
Yeah, that dies.
Yeah. So Heinz has this whole thing where it's his daughter wants to go with him to space and she dies.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, did that really happen to him?
Yeah, that was very
How did the
confusing.
ship know?
Well, it's also like there was no indication at the beginning that his daughter did die because everyone else is being like, hey, he has a daughter and she's 10. And like, if there's never a moment where he's like, Heinz is like, don't talk about my kid.
Yeah, so I'm like, I was very confused as if he was remembering a thing that happened or if the ship was somehow making him experience like his worst nightmare kind of a thing. And it never is clear in that regard.
Yeah.
I think the themes of it are pretty apparent. It's essentially the idea that like memories that are so painful, they shatter the boundaries between life and death. That like something so bad happened that you like can't die because it was so bad.
Yeah.
And so you just keep on existing in a way. There's a lot of like going back and forth between things that look very beautiful, but they're ultimately an illusion. And then when we see the reality on the space station, it's much more gruesome and ugly.
Yeah.
And so I think there's themes of that, of like, we pretend that certain things aren't that bad until we ultimately have to face them, sort of a thing. But I would say overall, I thought, comparing this to the other two, where do you think it ranks?
Second?
Okay, second.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the next short film, Stink Bomb. This one goes for a much more comedic tone.
Yeah.
It's set on Earth. It's a lab technician named Nobu Tanaka who has the flu, and he works at like a research and development laboratory. And one of his coworkers tells him there's a scientist who's been developing like a flu pill. Just go into his office and take one. He goes in and he takes the wrong pill.
No, it wasn't he takes the wrong pill. It's supposed to be like he wasn't.
Or the pill isn't what he thought it was.
Yeah.
And it's part of like it's a biological weapon.
Yeah, and it's a sample on it.
And so I think it reacts to the flu shot he already took. So I think if he hadn't had the flu shot, it was an anti-vax movie. So he starts.
I mean, the first thing is called Corona. I mean,
he's emitting a deadly body odor because he takes a nap, and when he wakes up, everyone in the lab is dead, and there's this kind of growing green cloud coming around him, which he seems to be visibly unaware of. That was the thing that was kind of strange to me. And it's just this thing where the comedy of it is that the situation escalates as it goes on, where the cloud grows larger, the military and the government keep throwing more things to try to stop him, and they all fail. There's some very interesting commentary on the influence of the American military on Japanese government in this, which I thought was very interesting. What did you think of Stink Bomb?
I think it's also just showing how the higher ups don't have all the information as they think that they do. Because when he does pass out, he's like,
who's he?
Main guy.
Nobu.
Okay. So when he wakes up and he happens to go into like a security room where like meetings were going on, and they're just like, oh hey, like where is everybody? He's like, he doesn't say that they're dead. He's like, they're unconscious.
Yeah, and he just thinks they all passed out.
And so they're like, oh well, can you bring the pills and bring the following documents to me to Tokyo? And their assumption is like, oh, this kid is going to bring up all the information, not knowing that he is exactly the chaos that's bringing this forward. Mm-hmm. And since he is not really dim-witted, he's so unaware and thinking he's going to do such a good job by doing what they need to do that they're just going to we need to maybe kill this kid, or we need to stop him. It's like also the fact that like his family ends up watching on television what's going on with him.
They bring them in to tell him to go back to the laboratory and to not go any further. Because the whole thing is he's walking towards Tokyo.
He's like on a bike at some point.
Yeah, he gets different vehicles and things. Mm-hmm. I found it to be kind of a satire about the military industrial complex, obviously, but presenting this idea of something so horrific in its destructive power that it becomes farce. Yeah. That it's so massive and uncontrollably devastating to humanity that it's not even scary anymore. It's just, you laugh at the absurdity of what we've done and what we've created.
Yeah.
Which I think feels very true, because it doesn't seem as though there's ever been an instance in the development of like human war machines that we've de-escalated ever in any way. It's always like upping the ante and developing, more efficient, quicker ways to kill people. Never like, how can we create, non-lethal things that actually are non-lethal, and we don't just call them non-lethal and then use them in a lethal way, kind of thing. What did you think about this being a comedic short? Because it's just, you could do it like totally, serious and earnest and make it really sad.
I think it took me a little bit to realize it was comedic, just because like it's not belly laughs comedic. It is like, it's like as if Mr. Bean was given like an important task.
I think that's because like there's nothing remarkable about Nobu. He is a completely mundane, normal person.
Yeah, and it's just like, and that he's just bored, and like it's also like it's a cautionary tale of, if you're sick, stay the fuck home.
That is true. Yeah. Like, yeah, you could flip it around and go, well, it's not really about the military industrial complex. It's about like how, plagues happen. And if we just let people stay home when they're sick, we wouldn't be spreading this.
Yeah, because he was like, oh, I don't stay home because there's not a cute girl to take care of me. And I'm like, that's so fucking dumb.
But I mean, like, I think it fits the character.
Yeah.
Because he is very shallow.
And it's like, the weird thing is, like, again, the higher ups don't know, because like then you think you know who the higher ups, and it just turns out to be the Americans taking control.
Well, yeah, because that's what happens at the end. Is there's like 3 American military officials who then use pre-existing Japanese law, which of course the Japanese Constitution was written by the United States after World War II, to take control of the situation, and they don't make it any better. In fact, they add an element to the story that makes it even worse and leads to the ending of the short. I thought it did once again, like with the first one, this also does a very good job of scale.
Yeah,
because we start in a very intimate setting, like this little office, but by the end, like, you really feel the scale of the spaces that Nobu is moving through.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like him going on the motorcycle, and then you see the helicopters above him. Like, you see the scale of how big it is and how the stakes are getting higher and higher. I think it's just like the one thing that's just like, maybe to me, because I'm so sort of used to, when it comes to comedy, of it being like, oh, we're just gonna stick to his point of view until we realize like how stupid this all is. Because it jumps back to when they're like doing it to the officials, you kind of feel like, oh, this has to be serious, kind of thing. Only to get back to him, and he's just sort of like, all I'm trying to do is give you these papers and these pills, because you told me that the ambulance could not discover this because they were doing secret like service stuff. And it turns out like they weren't supposed to be doing secret service stuff.
Yeah.
And they just put it upon themselves to do it, and it's a mess.
But yeah, I enjoyed this one quite a bit. I thought it was pretty good. It reminded me a lot of Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I was thinking about like it cutting back to like the higher up.
So like, so far you have the first one reminds me of Alien, the next one reminds me of Dr. Strangelove. So there's kind of it's very clear that like these aren't necessarily the most original ideas ever, but it's this particular creator's take on these tropes and concepts.
We're putting it in more of a Japanese culture setting.
And this is one that was interesting because the fact that it made so clear the difference between like the Japanese government and the US military, and that the idea is that the US military is always present during Japanese like meetings of this level, which is also another way for them to talk about the interference of this foreign power and their ability to like make decisions for themselves, kind of thing.
Yeah.
How would you compare Stink Bomb to Magnetic Rose?
I feel like I would put that Stink Bomb above Magnetic Rose.
So you think it's the best of the 3?
Yeah.
Okay. Third one, Cannon Fodder, which by default, this is the one you like the least, right?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, folks. This is the best one. This is the best one. She's wrong. Okay. I'm not going to say it happens a lot. It doesn't. Normally she's right because she agrees with me. But on this one, she's wrong. So, Cannon Fodder, it's a walled city that is engaged in a perpetual war. Like, every building has enormous cannons mounted on top, with like the most gigantic cannon being on the biggest building. The entire city and their industry centers around the production and the application of these military weapons all the time. That's all they teach in the schools. Everybody wears clothing that shows their role as either a factory worker or a part of this military industrial complex. And we just essentially get to watch a day in the life, focused mainly on a father and son. The father works in the large cannon and is just a cannon loader, which is important, but not very high up on the hierarchy here. We never see the enemy. They keep calling it the moving city. And so all of the cannons are on these kind of swivel mounts so they can turn the tops of the buildings in whatever direction. The news tells us about that there's a moving city, and it says that the cannon launch was successful, but in the film we never see that once. We don't even know what the name of the enemy is, who they're fighting. And so at one point the boy's father makes a mistake and he is punished by having to stand next to the cannon without his safety gear on. And the boy kind of fantasizes about being the officer who gets to press the button that fires it. So like I said, it's very like slice of life, but in a horrific alternate universe kind of a thing. So tell me what you thought about cannon fodder.
I mean, it's kind of depressing, but it's also, like you said, it was a day in the life, so to them, this is not depressing.
It's
day to day.
You're meant to be horrified. They won't, because this is just what existence is.
And I think it's just close to maybe what America is settling into right now. Mm-hmm. Again, it does, just because it's not my favorite doesn't mean it's like it doesn't have its.
So you mean you hate it? You hate it?
Yeah, totally hate it. I feel like it's disgusting. Why did you put it in my eyeballs?
It didn't make me feel good.
It didn't give me fee-fees. It did not make me smile.
To me, I read it as it's looking at, well, what does a society look like when fascism becomes completely dominant?
Yeah.
There's no history. Like, I don't know who these people are or what they believe in or who they're fighting or what they're fighting for. It's just war for the sake of war, essentially.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that one of the like design details was like everybody wears helmets.
Yeah, even the kids at school are wearing like helmets. Yeah, but we never see anything launched from the enemy side.
No.
So that's once again you're left going like, is there even an enemy, or if they just imagine an enemy and it's a way of like forcibly unifying all these people? It feels like it's a short film about human existence reduced to being a cog in a machine.
Yeah.
And because like from the father's point of view, he already is a cog. The son dreams of being the most important cog in the machine, which is like really sad. But on reflection, isn't that the way a lot of America operates, right? People who are, working class, working poor, their dreams are to be the most important cog in the machine. They're like, I'll be the boss in charge. And then, I'll really have respect and I'll be in my rightful place. And it's a very dystopian way of thinking, because that shouldn't be what you aspire to be as the top cog.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how like just joyful the boy is about this as an idea. Like the same way you might fantasize about, a superhero. He fantasizes about the guy who presses the button. And that's especially, I think, what made it even more like depressing in a good way, as I like depressing movies, is that there isn't even an effort to fashion a boogeyman. So like, let's say there isn't even an enemy. They don't even show you like an image of what they think the enemy looks like, which at least that means you have to imagine you're fighting something. But just the idea of you're in a city surrounded by clouds of smoke and dust because you're launching cannons all the time. So they really can't see that far outside the city anyway.
Yeah.
And they're just relying on the government and the media to tell them, no, it's successful. It's going successfully. We know you don't see it. We know you can't feel any effects from it, but just trust us. This is going well. Does that remind you of anything, Ariana?
The States. Not the USA.
But I would say out of the three, I think this, from a like thematic story point of view, this is my favorite. From a technical point of view, I think Magnetic Rose is my favorite. The animation, I think, was really, really good. And so you rank this at the bottom of three.
Why do I feel like this is a judgment upon me? There's just
Order's in session. The Honorable Judge Harris. is resigning. You may be seated. Now, Ms. Ramos.
No, we're not doing.
I hear that you don't care for cannon fodder. You want to explain to me why?
No Southern.
So, like, what
old
about
man
it?
would
What
know
about
about
it kept it from being better than the other two for you?
I think it was hard for me to stay engaged with it.
Was this because you were high?
Yes.
Okay. And this was the last one in the film. So it's not the quality of the film. It's because this pothead over here was like, I'm getting tired.
I'm getting sleepy and they're barely talking, so
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of dialogue
no,
in
there
that
wasn't
one.
a lot of dialogue. So like, and it's just I feel like in remembering it, I probably would have appreciated it had I watched it separate from the other two.
I did see a lot of people talking on Letterboxd saying the same thing. Like if they had watched them each as individual episodes.
Yeah.
And we kind of said that about like The House when we reviewed that, where
Yeah.
if I'd been able to see them each in isolation, I might have had a different opinion. But that's the problem with anthology films is every time you start a new film, you reset the momentum to zero.
Yeah, and especially because like they're like at the least the house, there was a correlation that all of them were theming around a house. This we really didn't have.
It was just an author.
Yeah, it was just an author. So it was like at first we're just like, oh well, Magnetic Rose, like the memories of just being so like hard and haunting. But then there's nothing about memories with the second.
Yeah, there's nothing
one.
that seems to connect them.
And so it is just
other than the author, yeah.
And it is also sort of like it kind of is shifting gears even in style.
Yes. Well, each film has a different director and each film has a different writer for the screenplay. Or actually, Otomo wrote Stink Bomb and Cannon Fodder. He did not write the screenplay for Magnetic Rose. That screenplay was written by Satoshi Kon, who directed one of the best films ever made, Perfect Blue.
Yeah, that is amazing. So like even like the styles shift because the last one kind of reminded me with the coloring and the lining of like The Last Unicorn.
It kind of reminded me of like Eastern European animation.
Yes, and so there I could see the influence, but it's like
it didn't look what we consider anime-ish. Like yeah. I would say the middle one is the most anime looking. Because the first one, I felt like they were trying to make them look a little more realistic in terms of like proportions of the characters. The middle one, it was cartoonish in the way that they were drawn, but that was kind of the point. It was meant to be comedic.
But I think it's like I probably would have appreciated it more had I seen it separately and not had to like, not that I was dreading through them. It's just also sort of like then you mentally have to prepare yourself that it's like, okay, this is going to be completely different from everything else. But your mind is really wanting to make a connection.
So at this point, would you say they need to ban anthology films? That they're do you think anthology films are the worst kind of film?
I feel like it would be better off to promote it like a mini series. Like watch them individually, let like every end of it just like have
more like a Twilight Zone scenario.
Yes, because then you can have the animators to have their spotlight because at the end of credits it's just going to be like I knew because I went like when I went to school, like art school, like I remember like the animation kids would stay just to see who animated what. And I can't imagine like if you are a huge anime fan of just being like, okay, well, I'll just wait until I go online to see who did what.
Because I feel like this was made because Akira was such a massively successful movie.
Yeah.
So this was like because he made another movie in between that I've never seen, Rojin Z, which is another kind of sci-fi animated thing. And I mean, I really love Akira. Like, I'm not an anime fan, but I do think Akira is like one of the best science fiction movies ever made.
Yeah.
Because it's such great world building.
Well, it's also just like very weird upon itself. Like, at the least by the standards of like the anime that I used to watch when I was growing up, and I can barely name any of them at the time.
You can't name movies we watched last week.
No,
so
it's fine. But it's just like if I were
how's that wig going for you?
This feels like a very judgmental thing.
This is an intervention,
Just you at the intervention.
It's an intervention of one. That's how we do it in America now. I don't need a whole group of people. I'm going to intervene on by myself.
Hyper individualism, really there.
Hyper individualistic interventions.
But it's like even the style, like Akira, is so different from other animes, and even like the storyline is just like how the villain.
It feels
like,
very archetypal. Like
yes.
it created a type of anime that has been copied endless times since.
But it's never gonna have the same feeling as Akira did.
Well, because I think about this thing, and I feel like the strength of Memories was the world building. Each short felt like a very realized world.
Like that if you went to go to the designer or the animator, they could tell you a ton of stuff about this world that we didn't even physically
like there's other stories to tell in this world. We just don't get to hear them, right? But it felt like, the way they set up the whole salvage operation and all that, and the kind of space travel that was happening in Magnetic Rose, I could feel like, no, this feels like a fleshed out world. Like Stink Bomb, it does feel like there's a very stylized world here.
Yeah.
The technology. And then Cannon Fodder, of course, is all, the whole short is basically a piece of world building with the day in the life angle. But would you recommend Memories to people who enjoyed Akira?
Ooh, yes, I would.
I enjoyed Akira, and I enjoyed this movie.
Am I recommending it to you?
No, I've already seen it. But yeah, I would say, now, would you recommend it to people who haven't seen Akira? Do you think it's something somebody who doesn't already have a connection to this creator would care about?
Connection to Akira, I would still tell you to watch it, but I would tell you to take breaks between them.
Yeah.
Just so you're not like kind of confused or muddled, and also come into the idea that none of these stories are really connected to one another besides the fact of like the creator of Akira helped participate or like wrote or directed one of them.
And I would recommend Akira because that movie is great. And that comes from somebody who hates anime. I'm not saying hates strong. I've watched a lot of anime in my life, not as much as some people, but most of it just doesn't hit with me, where I'm like, I don't get why this is enjoyable. I'm happy for the people that like it, but it's not my thing. I think
the thing about anime, it's sort of like, it's kind of like telenovelas, where it is just a segmented thing.
What has its own like tropes and style and aesthetics and everything.
That's hard for you to get into because you kind of like more of a reality based series if you're gonna go into it. Like,
well, I'm very particular about when something is like hyper stylized. Mm-hmm. Like there's got to be a good balance, because I've seen a lot of things that like, wow, the visuals are inventive and wild, but the characterization is poor, and so I can't. I need like characters that feel authentic in wild situations. That works for me.
Yeah, and I think that's why you don't relate to anime, and that's why you hate Japan.
Well, we should have finished the job that we did in WW2. So, no, I don't really hate Japanese people. I just dislike them a little. No, but I would say like Akira was one I enjoyed, and then we previously mentioned Perfect Blue by Satoshi Kon.
Perfect Blue is like a perfect movie.
Oh God. I can imagine if you were a film reviewer in the 1990s writing for a newspaper, you're like, Perfect Blue is a perfect hit.
Who is it that basically owns Perfect Blue so he could just strip images from it?
What?
Like, there's a director that, like, the guy that did The Whale.
Oh, Darren Aronofsky, because he wanted to make a live action version.
But then all he did was just like strip little like scenes.
Well, in Black Swan, Black Swan is basically a live action remake of Perfect Blue, kind of.
No, Perfect Blue is just way better.
Perfect Blue is the best. Yeah, what were we reviewing again? Memories. So I would say the best place if you're trying to get into anime is probably not a short film anthology. You would think that might be a good gateway, but in this instance, I don't think it is. This is kind of like, it's almost like a B-sides where you're like, no, this is for people who are a big fan of this band. These are like just rare cuts of things. If you bring someone like a Grateful Dead B-sides, there's gonna be, I don't know. I just listen to music. Or like, I had a roommate in college who shall remain nameless.
Hope he listens to the podcast.
No, I don't think he does. He doesn't.
No,
I don't think. I mean, if he does, I'd love to.
I got some emails.
Who he loved Oasis, and one of his things was he would pirate like Oasis concert recordings off of the internet. And that they're just people who like they want to be a completionist, right? They want to have every recorded instance of this artist. I want it. And that's what Memories feels like, is there were people that wanted more of Katsuhiro Otomo. And so they were like, let's give them this short film and they'll love it. Kind of.
Yeah.
Well, that was the Pop Cult podcast for this week. We hope you enjoyed our episode. Make sure to check out our show notes for relevant links to anything we might have mentioned or just to all the various places you can find us. Make sure to subscribe wherever it is you listen to this podcast so you'll be notified when new episodes pop up. And visit popcult.blog for more reviews that we do write-ups on every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and more on the weekends. Currently, we're in the sort of tail end of a series on new German cinema where we've been looking at movies directed by Werner Herzog, Werner Rainier Fassbinder, and Wim Wenders, among some other directors. And we'll be wrapping that up here in the coming week. In May, we're going to be doing a month-long series that we're calling the American Theater on Film Volume 1, because there are a lot of movies based on stage plays, but we're really going to try to focus on movies that maybe aren't the best film they're plays that people think of the play first before they think of a movie adaptation. Let's put it that way. So like Death of a Salesman, The Iceman Cometh, A Raisin in the Sun, those types of things. And I'm looking forward to that because for many of those, I've never even seen a performance of a play or read the script. So it'll be kind of my first exposure to the full story there. So if you like what we do here on the podcast, or you like what we do over on popcult.blog, we would like you to think about supporting us on Patreon. We have a variety of different reward levels and some goals that we've been working to reach. With that said, I want to thank our patrons, Becca and Matt. They donate at the $10 level. Donating at $10, one of the big perks you get there is you get to pick a movie for me to watch once a month. And you can even add your own commentary into that review if you want. And so this month, I know Matt has picked Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder, and Becca chose Where the Crawdads Sing, which was not a movie I would have picked, but that's part of the fun. You get to make me watch a movie, even if I don't want to watch it. And those reviews will be popping up here in the coming week. Well, until next time, keep listening.